in any weather.
National News of Wales, tonight with Nicola Heywood Thomas and Hugh Weeks.
Good evening. The top news stories in Wales tonight. The Sea Empress study calls for oil firms to pay more after disasters.
Clothing workers march to confront the boss who sacked them.
And the jury reached some verdicts on the priest accused of sex assaults. It's now nearly 2 years since a stricken Liberian tanker spilled more than 70,000 tonnes of oil into the sea off West Wales. For many, that disaster will long be a painful memory. Well, now companies responsible for major oil spills are being asked to pay a bigger share of the clean-up bill. The call was made as the results of a 2-year study into the Sea Empress disaster were released. They were discussed at an international conference in Cardiff.
On a rocky cove across the water from where the Sea Empress went aground 2 years ago this weekend, you can still find signs of the environmental disaster. Just inches beneath the ground, a thick scum of oil residuals coats the sand. A telltale rainbow effect stretches down the beach towards flora and fauna.
We're here in an important wildlife area for shellfish and birds, and so it is a potential threat to those birds 2 years after the original spill.
72,000 tonnes of oil spilled out of the Sea Empress. It eventually coated over 200 kilometres of coastline from St David's in the west to Pendine and Carmarthen Bay in the east. Around 7,000 oiled birds were washed ashore. Local fisheries were shut for months. Tourists stayed away in droves. Today, an international conference in Cardiff was told of the need for further studies to monitor the long-term effects. There were also demands for the oil industry itself to pay the bill for such studies, which have so far cost more than £2 million.
It seems to us that the investigations which relate to this kind of damage, the kind of work which SIG largely did, should be picked up not from the national purse, not from people like you, but by the people who are responsible for the pollution.
Back in Pembrokeshire, the tourism trade has welcomed the scientific work, but some people are worried about the constant references to the horror story they'd sooner forget.
The molluscs are growing again, the fishermen are fishing again, the fish are here, the seabirds are back in great numbers. No, I don't see. I would say let's sleep in dog's light.
Yet Wales Tonight revealed only yesterday that the effects of Sea Empress do continue.
The news on HTV last night that fishermen in Sonesford are packing up and moving on elsewhere because of the decline in fish stocks is very worrying. Whether this has any relevance to the Sea Empress we don't fully understand yet, but that is why we need full detailed studies for years to come.
Now government must consider the recommendations for change, the experts warning the next disaster could be even worse. Well, joining me now is the man who's chaired much of the scientific committee work which has been released here today, Professor Ron Edwards. Professor, what would you sum up as being the main finding of this whole work?
I think the main finding is that we were remarkably fortunate with the whole of this Sea Empress disaster. I mean, it could have been far, far worse than it was. It was serious enough, but if we'd had it in the summer with a wind blowing onshore and with oil that didn't evaporate, we would have been in a real mess. But fortunately, it happened in the winter when there weren't tourists, when the birds weren't nesting, and when many of the fish were out at sea. And it happened with winds blowing the oil out to sea in a southerly direction. And fortunately, the oil was so light that 40% of it evaporated. So we were saved from what could have been a very bad disaster indeed.
Now, you've given us your results here this morning, but you're saying you need to do more work yet.
Well, I mean, the problem isn't over. We're still unsure as to what damage was caused to the fisheries. We're also unsure as to whether some of the birds, like the guillemot, for example, are breeding successfully or as successfully as they were. And there are other problems which mean that we have to continue monitoring for a number of years before we can assess the real damage.
And the other area, what's actually done for the next time? If, God forbid, there isn't actually a next time, you want more work on the contingency plans?
Well, that is true. I think one of the things we need to do is to persuade government that more needs to be done to protect ourselves from these accidents and not let them occur.
Having listened to all that you've heard over the last 2 years now, do you fear that there could be a reputation?
Oh, we shall never ever stop accidents. They're always bound to occur, but what we can do is humanly try to minimise them and to minimise the damage that they cause.
Professor, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. And now back to the studio in Cardiff for the rest of the night's news.
Sacked workers from the former Laura Ashley factory at Machynlleth today marched to the doorstep of the company which dismissed them. The plant was taken over by a Port Talbot firm, Merchants Design. Today the protesters demanded to know why the business collapsed and where their unpaid wages are.
Women travelled across Wales today to meet the man they believe let them down.
This is it. Yes, this is it. It is it. The door's locked. Surprise, surprise.
Show to the letterbox.
Come out if you've got nothing to hide. Howard. Come out and face us, Malcolm. Come on. Don't be such a creep. Face us in person.
The man they wanted to talk to is Malcolm Davis, director of Merchants Design, which took over the Laura Ashley factory at Machynlleth and put it into liquidation in 6 months.
I'm unhappy about the way the factory's been sold as well to this guy. You know, what sort of checks were done on him. It makes you wonder, I could have gone in there and bought the factory for £1 and made the mess that he's done. Anybody could. And it's unfair because there's 60 people's lives that have been ruined by it. And we only wanted to work. That's all we asked for.
Unable to get an answer from the company, the workers decided to leave their calling cards in the shape of protest banners. Despite being rebuffed today, the women say they intend to keep up pressure on the company until they get answers to what they consider are legitimate questions. Nick Partridge, Wales Tonight.
And workers have been protesting outside Merthyr Tydfil Council this evening over possible job cuts. Members of the GMB union fear up to 200 are under threat as the council faces making £5.5 million worth of cuts. They say services will suffer and blame the Welsh office for not giving the council enough money.
A teenager who stabbed a man to death near a North Wales holiday beach is tonight starting a life sentence. Derek Hughes from Rhyl was found guilty of murder after an 8-day trial at Mole Crown Court. The jury heard that Jonathan Deroy Harper was killed in a row over a stolen sweatshirt.
Derek Hughes was 18 when he carried out a frenzied attack on 20-year-old Leroy Harper one summer night 18 months ago among the sand dunes leading to Tolachra Beach near Prestatyn. The jury heard he suspected Leroy of stealing his brother's sweatshirt, so he stabbed him more than 40 times with a lock knife. Then he went back to his flat in Rhyl, burnt his clothes and asked his brother to clean his blood-stained trainers. Later he confessed what he'd done to a 15-year-old friend. Tonight the jury found him guilty of murder by an 11-1 majority. Passing sentence, Mr Justice Sack said Hughes had shown no remorse or regret, and he said the reason for the murder was so ludicrous as to be beyond belief.
It was a nasty, vicious killing, almost a cowardly killing, of a young man who had recently moved to Rhyl, had only been there about 3 weeks, maybe to start a new life. A man who certainly didn't deserve this end.
Hughes held his head in his hands before being led away to start a life sentence. John Schoen, Wales Tonight, Mole Crown Court.
A jury at Cardiff Crown Court has reached verdicts on 11 of the 21 charges against a priest accused of indecently assaulting children. But Father John Lloyd will have to wait until tomorrow at the earliest to find out what those verdicts are. The jury have been sent home for the night before continuing their deliberations tomorrow.